We're going to begin by talking about two related concepts today. The first is determining targets for your outcomes and measuring whether you're actually achieving them. And the other is setting targets for activities and outputs in order to measure progress toward outcomes. And then at the second part of the class, we're going to do something quite different. We're going to begin talking about evaluation, about determining whether you actually made a difference. Why bother setting outcome targets and measuring whether you succeeded? The answer is pretty simple. Whatever your organization's goals are, it's to make the world a better place, and you want to know whether you've actually succeeded in doing so in a measurable way. Why bother measuring activities and outputs and monitoring your own performance? Well, for one thing, we had a theory of change and logic model which predicted how we were going to achieve our outcomes, and you need to know whether you're on the path to achieving outcomes. It's also just a matter of fundamental organizational management. There's a saying that you can't manage what you can't measure, and in this case, what we want to do is know whether we are on the path to achieving our outcomes. So how do you go about developing metrics for your targets? One system that many people use is called SMART, S-M-A-R-T. S stands for specific, clear and focused so that there's no misinterpretation. M is measurable. They can be quantified and compared to other data. A is attainable, achievable, reasonable, and credible. R is realistic. It fits into the organization's constraints and is cost-effective. T is timely. It's doable within the time frame given. So let's look at the outcomes for our three logic models for homelessness and see what SMART metrics might be for targets for the outcomes. So the first outcome was to improve the physical and mental health of homeless people. And here we have some very specific targets. Reduce acute incidence of asthma by 25%, meet accepted standards of treatment for diabetes and high blood pressure for 25% of homeless clients. Another outcome is to reduce the use of emergency services in incarceration. And here our goal is to reduce the use of ambulance service in emergency rooms by 10%. Finally, improve public safety and the well-being of residents and businesses. And the goal here is to reduce crimes by homeless clients by 20%. And now let's turn to the logic model for permanent supportive housing and look at the outcome metrics there. For the outcome, previously homeless people have permanent supportive housing. Our target is within 5 years, 25% of the city's chronically homeless population will be in stable residence in permanent housing. And finally, let's look at the ultimate outcomes in the logic model for preventing homelessness. Here, the ultimate outcome is individuals and families at risk of homelessness are not evicted. And our target is, within 1 year after our program is in operation, we'll reduce the number of evictions by people identified as at risk by 50%. So we've set targets for our outcomes for all three strategies, but how do we know if we achieved them? In everyday life, we often know whether we achieved an outcome. If you're taking an airplane trip, you know whether you got to the place or not. With respect to social interventions, it's sometimes harder. For example, let's look at the outcomes for our logic model for on-the-street interventions for homeless people. The first of our outcomes was to improve the physical and mental health of homeless people, and the first of our metrics was to reduce acute incidence of asthma by 25%. But consider the difficulties of getting accurate demographic and epidemiological data from transient homeless populations. Let's turn to outputs, which are much easier to measure than outcomes, because every organization measures its major outputs. That's part of managing an organization. So let me turn first to the outputs for street interventions. One major output in street interventions was to provide physical and mental health services and drug abuse services to the chronically homeless. And an output for this is to engage, diagnose, and treat 30 clients a month. Another was to create temporary shelters, and an output there is to accommodate 20 people each night. Notice that this is something completely within the control of the organization. And let's turn to the model for permanent supportive housing. Our first output is to obtain units for permanent supportive housing, and our target for the output is 10 units per month during the first 6 months of the program. Again, that's something that the organization can readily keep track of. And finally, we turn to the outputs for preventing homelessness. And without reading all the details of the output column, the target there is to identify and counsel 20 clients per month. Again, something that's easy for the organization to keep track of. So just like someone taking a trip, the nonprofit organization keeps track of its progress and learns whether it has gotten to its destination as it intended.